Lisa Vetten's work in the field of gender violence has been long and varied. In encompassing counselling, paralegal assistance, and expert testimony, training, policy development and analysis, as well as research and writing. Her work spans the fields of law, policing, social care, state, and women's movements. She is a former specialist advisor to the Commission for Gender Equality. She is currently a member of the Ministerial Task Team, advising the Minister of Higher Education and Training on measures intended to address GBV in higher educational institutions. Lisa is a research associate of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits and a project consultant on the study Gender Violence and Urban Transformation in India and South Africa, based in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg. She holds a Higher Diploma in Adult Education, a Master's in Political Studies, and is currently completing her PhD. So she is overqualified to speak to us tonight. As
sounds like it. Wow.
Thank you, Lisa. It's over to you.
Thanks very much. If it's okay, I'm going to leave my video off because there is one patch in my house where I get a signal. And just before I joined you, I put the video on and the light is so bad. So I hope you don't mind if you just end up looking at a PowerPoint instead of me.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay. I think also because we're a relatively small group, I'm also quite happy for us to, let me just share this, to make this fairly engaged. And if you would like to comment or stop and ask questions as we go on with the discussion, as we go through the discussion, I'm happy for that as well. You know, we don't all have to sit here in silence while I do all my slides and then take questions. So I'm perfectly happy with that. If that's okay with you, Angela, I think, or Leon.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. I'll look out for questions and we can always stop you if someone has a question. And I think if people will just jump in if they do have a question along the way or a comment, then let's do that.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, there we go. It's about to change. So what I really want to focus on is to talk a little bit about what kind of problem gender-based violence is and how do we tackle it. Our solutions or our attempts to intervene or our attempts to change things are really only as good as the thinking that we bring to the problem. So a lot of what I would like to focus on is talking a little bit about how do we think about this and how do we define, what kind of problem do we define it as? Because the way we define it as a problem is going to obviously determine what we think are the possible options. And some of the ways we think prevent us from thinking about different ways of trying to intervene or address the problem. So that's what I want to really focus on in a range of different ways. And in the hope, I think that we can move beyond what are sometimes quite glib and superficial conversations. Gender-based violence is a complex problem. That doesn't necessarily mean complicated, although it is complicated, but complex in the sense that there are many parts to it that we would need to address. And sometimes I think we tend to reduce those down to one simple thing. So I'm hoping through this presentation to to complicate that a little bit. So I think just to begin with, you know, the word gender-based violence gets thrown around a lot, but I think we have to be quite clear about what exactly are we talking about. There's very much a tendency to use it to refer to women, that gender-based violence refers to things that happen to women. So, and they will usually be done by men, and then sometimes some men, if they are harmed by women, say, well, that's gender-based violence as well. But I think what we need to do, if we want to understand what we mean by the term and have it useful, is to unpick both what we mean by gender and then think about how it's related to violence. So I think, to go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, most people think that gender refers to women and men. But I think the way to think about it is more than that. It's a way to make people into particular kinds. So not just men and women, but people who are interested in particular sorts of things, who dress in particular kinds of ways, who are thought to have particular skills and attributes, who study one kind of thing but not other kind of things, who make good leaders but don't make good leaders, who are suited to looking after children, who are not suited to looking after children. And very often I think those are social constructions, and I mean they're social constructions in the sense that when you start to examine different societies around the world, you can see that they have very different kinds of arrangements. And that starts to challenge our ideas that some of the differences between men and women are just natural. I think when you start to look around the world, you start to see that there are quite, in one society where it might be women who do all the farming, in another society it's considered natural for men to do all the farming. The point being that it is something that is a social construct. But beyond that, it's more than just a way of being a particular kind of person. It's also a way to order and sort society in different ways. So if you're a woman, you do this kind of work, you have these kinds of interests, you usually move in these kinds of circles, and you have a world that's typically organized around a home. If you are a man, then your work will, or your involvement in society will typically be outside of the home. It will have a lot less to do with children. You won't probably be working longer hours typically, because it's thought more appropriate for women to be spending all their time in relation to looking after children. So it's also a way in which we order people and then also typically put them into hierarchical relations to one another. You can see that in the way we just pay work. Which work gets valued, which work gets paid more than other kinds of work, and you'll very often see that those kinds of works are gendered. So when we talk about, say, pay disparity in South Africa and the fact that it's gendered, that's typically not necessarily because in workplaces where men and women are doing the same work, women are being paid less simply for doing the same work. It's the fact that we live in a society where men and women are doing different kinds of work, and the way that women and the work that women do is valued less. And the classic example is caring work. So domestic work, nursing, teaching, social work, looking after small children, all of that typically tends to be done by women, and it's part of the significant explanation as to why they do earn less than men in South Africa. And because they are so much more involved in doing caring work, which is typically unpaid, they're not going to be at work working all those extra hours, which tend to be one of the part of the reason why men end up earning more than women. So that's why I also say gender becomes a way to distribute society's burdens and benefits. So it becomes a way to see who gets the better pay, but who works the longer hours, who gets to work for work that is supposedly natural, and therefore to women, it's just their natures, and therefore they don't need to get paid for it. So that's, I'm giving you these examples of gender so that you can get an idea that it's a way to organize society. It's a way to organize society in ways that are hierarchical and which value things very differently. How does that then relate to violence? Well, typically it's going to affect who is going to use violence and who is likely to be a victim of what. So I think if we go back to the first point I was making, that it makes people into particular kinds, it is very much normative in South Africa and in most parts of the world that we encourage violence in men. I mean, if we take a look at our armies, for example, they're overwhelmingly comprised of men, and it's from that point of view, it's very useful to encourage violence in men, because how else would we have armies? Hence some of the difficulties people have with women being in the army, because we're not used to the idea of women using violence. But I think so that might be sanctioned, formalized violence, but it becomes more of a problem, I think, in broader society when we look at who tends to fill up our prisons, who tends to perpetrate the bulk of violence. We can see that gender is very much shapes who's likely to be perpetrating and who's likely to be a victim. But I think it also affects who's likely to be a victim of what. And I'll go through some slides on murder just to illustrate that. So it's much more, I think, because in South Africa, as in most parts of the world, we tend to associate sexuality in particular with women, that it's something that women have, that it's something men are entitled to, that women should be passive in sexual encounters and men active. It's part of the reason why you tend to see sexual forms of violence being much more likely to be targeted by men towards women than women towards men. And of course, gender also affects how we respond to violence. So I think we are much more used to thinking about women as victims and as vulnerable. And when we use that language of vulnerability, it's very gendered in the sense that we're typically talking about women. And we don't use it in relation to men. We typically don't think of them as vulnerable. And the flip side of that is that women do use violence. There is often a great deal of disapproval of that, and they might sometimes be treated more harshly than men because they're seen as having flouted in some ways gendered norms. So we can think a little bit about the relationship between gender and violence in those that it shapes who's likely to be a victim, who's likely to be a perpetrator, how we respond to it, who we accept it in, who we don't accept it in. I think, and also the other point about violence, and this goes to the previous point I was making about gender being a way to order or sort society, is that violence is often a way to assert one's dominance or to assert someone's inferiority or your subordination. So that unquestionably is related to forms of violence that women experience, and that is why we do speak of it as gendered violence, because it is related to particular ideas around women and men and their relationships to each other, which have been sanctioned in law. And the classic example I want to use here is marital rape. So up until 1993, it was not a crime for a husband to rape his wife. And that was based on the notion that, and we'll use Roman Dutch law here because that was the example, that a husband was entitled to the benefits of a relationship, and if there was resistance, he was entitled to meet resistance with force. So therefore, there was no crime. So this is why I think it's important to remember that violence is not necessarily aberrant or the work of sick people, that it's very often socially sanctioned. And by that meaning there is no law in place or law looks the other way. And I think domestic violence is a problem, is a form of violence that particularly suffers from people looking the other way. So so from that sort of general background, I want to look a little bit about how gender then does shape specifically murder in South Africa, because I think some of our data here is much better than the data for rape and domestic violence. Murder, I think, has at least been comparatively well studied, and you can really see how gender plays out to some extent. So this slide here is drawn from the South African police, and the point I really want to make with it is that you can see that that murder in South Africa went through a period where it decreased. That would have been to roughly 2011-12, and then from about 2012-13, it started to increase. And you can see that a trend that was downward has now been reversed and is now steadily on the increase every year. So that's murder in general, but I think it's now useful to break that up or to gender disaggregate so that we can see who is being murdered. And so here you can see what I mean about the impact of gender. If we talk about children, they comprise the smallest group, or the smallest proportion of those who are murdered every year. And the trend is somewhat down, although not that dramatically, from 2015-16 to 2019-20. For women, you can see the trend is jumping around a bit. It's down, but some years also increasing. So it's what we would probably call pretty much well stagnant. It's not getting better, it's not getting dramatically. It's not getting very much better, but it's also not getting very much worse. Where the increase lies is in relation to men. And you can see that roughly they are being murdered they make up about 80% of murder victims in South Africa. And that trend that I was pointing to is largely in relation to men. So this comparison in murder is clearly illustrating what I'm talking about in relation to gender. That men are not only the most likely to be the perpetrators of violence, they're also likely to be victims. But the kind of murder that men and women experience is also quite different. So from the data that we've been able to collect, where you can tell who the perpetrator is, more than half of women are murdered by an intimate partner. That is completely different to the picture for men. Half of men are not murdered by their female partners. Men, and this is the point I was making earlier about how we tend to associate women, or have created ways, or have created societies where women spend more of their time at home and more men spend their time outside, that you can see that the bulk of men's murders occur outside the home. They're also at the hands of acquaintances and strangers, whereas women's murders predominantly inside the home and their intimate male partners. And this links to the point I was making earlier about the fact of violence being sanctioned. We used to have, again, an inheritance of Roman Dutch law, the law of reasonable chastisement, which basically did give men the right to hit their female partners as long as the stick was no thicker than their thumb. And you can still hear, and there is still a case in South Africa in 1955, where a man who is separated from his wife wants her to go for a medical examination, which she refuses to do, and he cites as part of his right to demand that she goes, that he has this right over her conduct that did at some point include the right to reasonable chastisement. So I think those histories that have made it legitimate to use a certain degree of force and violence within relationships towards women is one of the reasons why we have to understand why women are so much more likely to die within the context of their relationships than men are. I think we've also got to remember that, and this again goes to the idea of chastisement and the idea that discipline is appropriate, is that again, in South Africa, we had up until about the mid-80s, for white, coloured and Indian women, we had most of the marital power removed. Some people may remember that. If you wanted to go and open up a bank account or a clothing store account, you needed your husband's permission first. And you did not have guardianship over your children. That was the marital power. The last of that, and it made women minors in marriage. The last of that went for white coloured and Indian women in 1993, and for Black African women in 1998, the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, which had also placed Black women in the position where they were perpetual minors. So these ideas that you have rights to chastisement and to discipline certainly play a role in some of the murders that you see being committed by women's intimate male partners. Some of the research I've done, when men explain what they're doing, it's that she wasn't listening to me. She didn't cook in the way I wanted. She didn't do things the way I liked her to. So there's very much the idea that you're there to please and carry out particular duties. And if you don't do that, well, then I have the right to chastise you. I think the issue here with men is, I think, the fact that these questions I wanted to sort of point at in terms of vulnerability is that in some respects if we look at the language of vulnerability, and if we use the test of who is vulnerable in relation to numbers, then quite clearly the group who are vulnerable to violence or to murder is men. But you'll notice that we don't tell men to stay at home or to not go anywhere unless they're in the company of women to protect them. That is something we only do with women. So that's where you can see ideas of gendered vulnerability, who need protection are playing themselves out in relation to murder and the way we speak about it publicly. If we look at, so although women's murder rates may be lower than those of men in South Africa, nonetheless, they are very high in comparison to the rest of the world. You can see that we are ranked 4th based on data from the World Health Organization. But you can see that Honduras is definitely not a place to live. If you look at that, it's heading towards 2.5, it's roughly 2.5 times our rate of homicide. And again, the rates for men are exactly, the rankings for men are exactly the same. Men's homicide also ranks South Africa 4th, with Honduras leading. So I think if you want to understand something about violence in South Africa, it would probably be very useful to look at what is it that we have in common with Jamaica, Lesotho, Guinea-Bissau, and Haiti? And how are we very different from, say, India and Canada, whose rates of homicide are so much lower than ours? So comparative studies can be very useful in helping us to sort out why you see these differences in murder. And then lastly, the last point I want to make is if we look in detail at women's murders, that the high point of homicide in South Africa historically from the 1990s was 1993, when 78 per 100,000 people were being murdered every year. It was just before the elections and levels of political violence were high, so that certainly influences why it was so high before then. But you can see in 2012 how things had altered. It had more, the rates of homicide in South Africa had more than halved. So something we did in those 15 odd years, no, 20 odd years, had an effect. And it wasn't just the political changes, but there were other things happening in South Africa that clearly helped to reduce murder. And I think it's important to look at that, because often when we look at violence in South Africa, we tend to get so overwhelmed and think there's nothing that we can do. But this data tells us that things change, and they can change for the better, which is why if you had this downward trend over a period of some 20 years, it is so concerning to see that from 2012, we've had an upward trend for now almost a decade. We've reversed whatever was going on between 1993 and 2012. So those are the overall rates for murder. If we look specifically at women's rates, we can see again a similar pattern. So in 1999, non-intimate femicide, which is killing of women by a non-partner, roughly 8.6 per 100,000 women were being murdered. In every 100,000 women were being murdered by a non-intimate. A decade later, you can see that it halved. So there had been an important reduction in the number of women being killed by strangers and those who were not their partners. The news is not quite as good when it comes to intimate partner killings. You can see it reduced from 8.8 per 100,000 to 5.6. So a decrease, but not necessarily statistically significant. The other area where we don't see a significant change at all really is in sexual homicides, rape murders. So in 1999, 3.4 in every 100,000 women were being killed in that fashion, which had decreased, but it's not in any way significant, to 2.5 per 100,000 a decade later. And the other form of homicide that's really important to look at, because it also starts to tell us what can be effective in reducing violence, is gun homicide. So in 1999, 7.5 per 100,000 women were being murdered with a gun. And these were legal firearms. But you can see that that's how significantly that decreases to 2.5 per 100,000. And one of the explanations for that is the Firearms Control Act. So again, if you're looking for things that make a difference, that was one of them. Introduced in 2001, it made it, you were not allowed to own a firearm if you had a history of domestic violence or a protection order against you, had histories of mental health difficulties, etc. And you can see that firearms control played an important role in reducing and bringing down the number of women being murdered. So I'm giving you that because I think it starts to show us where we can make a difference. And I think one of the reasons why we are seeing the increase in gun homicides is when women are killed with guns, traditionally it's by their intimate partners who hold licensed firearms. So putting in place gun control and making it more difficult to obtain a firearm saved women's lives. Somewhat different when we're dealing with men, because as I mentioned earlier, many men being killed outside by strangers, that is often with unlicensed firearms. So you will not, so firearms control may not always have as much of an impact on men's homicides, and we're seeing some of that now. You may have been following through the newspaper some of the cases around the former General Christian du Plessis, who was working in the police's firearms registry, who was selling back guns that the police had confiscated to the gangs on the Cape Flats. And the proliferation of firearms that has occurred as a result is certainly part of the reason why we're seeing the increases in murder. So I'm raising that again as once again to get a sense of the fact, to point to how violence is gendered. that's because we've created, in some respects, quite different ways for men and women to live. It will certainly alter and impact upon how they experience violence. So that's perhaps a rather dry look at figures in relation to homicide, is a way, I think, to try and tease apart the way in which gender impacts violence, and how long histories that include law have played their role in creating such different experiences of violence. So I think just to look a little bit at rape. So these figures come from the police, so they will obviously not capture rapes that are not reported. But they again make a point that in some parts of the country, rape is going up. So these are the stations I've selected here are amongst the top 30 stations that record the highest rates of rape in the country. And they have also, over a 10-year period, showed an increase. So again, to emphasize the point that time is very important, that it's very, if you want to understand a phenomenon like violence, it's important to look at it over time, to look at the trend, to see what is just a one-year aberration and what is part of, and what is actually something that is something more persistent and more entrenched that requires a great deal of attention, because it's obviously becoming an entrenched way of relating in some respect. So you can see that the areas where some of the greatest concerns would be in South Africa would be Lusiki in the Eastern Cape, and Delft in the Western Cape, and Diepsloot in Gauteng. Again, I think why it's useful to break up the statistics like that. Obviously, they're affected by the fact that the police haven't taken into account the fact that you're dealing with different populations. And so, you know, these may not necessarily be the highest in the country because they haven't taken population into account. But these figures do start to tell us that there are different dynamics going on in different parts of the country, and that a one-size-fits-all solution is not adequate. There are localized dynamics that need to be understood if we want to intervene effectively. And I think in the next slide, I want to show another reason why it's important to look quite closely at why violence appears to increase. So if we look at Diepsloot, the blue line is for the number of rapes reported at Douglasdale Police Station, which is where residents of Diepsloot had to go and report. And then they had a police station opened in 2010. And you can see the difference that access to policing makes to being able to report rape. So it's not that there was no rape in Diepsloot before. It's the fact that women had to spend a lot of money on taxi fare to get to Douglasdale to go and report. And the fact that barriers to reporting were put in place meant that many rapes were going unreported and unaddressed. And you can see from the pink line what happened once a police station was opened up in Diepsloot and you made justice accessible. So sometimes increases and decreases are the result of practical things, like just having access to a service of whatever nature. So I think, you know, you've lots of numbers and figures. What does that mean? What do they mean? And what do they imply for what we ought to be doing? So I think just to repeat the point that I was making, that violence is located in time and space. It's not a static phenomenon. It's not unchanging. It isn't the same everywhere. And that is incredibly important to understand why, if we want to try to understand how do we change and do something about it? How do we make people's lives more bearable in areas where violence is very high? And quite clearly, that's supposed to be worlds. Quite clearly, we are living in a multiplicity of social worlds. We might be living in the same country, but our social worlds are clearly very different, and we have very different experiences. And these need to be understood if we want to try and tackle violence and produce meaningful ways of intervening. And then I think looking at that data, what does it tell us about what kind of problem violence is? So that one slide I said was suggesting it's a problem. It's not a problem of that not having a police station doesn't could possibly be contributing to violence, because if it's going unreported, it gets continued because there are no consequences. So sometimes violence can be a consequence of there not being effective policing in place. Or if there isn't policing, sometimes poor policing. I think one of the consistent complaints one hears is that the police don't act on protection orders, for example. So the protection order is there to prevent you from being abused within your relationship. But if the police don't come when you phone them, and if they don't, assuming you even have a phone to call them with, and if they don't arrest your partner as they're supposed to do, then that protection order is a waste of time. It doesn't serve its purpose. And then violence does become a problem of ineffective policing. It can also be a problem of a lack of access to healthcare, emergency healthcare in particular. So to go back to the homicide data, some women die because they live in informal settlements or in rural areas where they are a great distance from emergency healthcare, or they live in areas, and I mean, this can be a situation past the Cape Flats where ambulances will not go because it's too dangerous. And so they die because they are stabbed, they bleed to death before they get attention, or perhaps their lungs are punctured, they don't get to healthcare on time. So sometimes it can be a lack of access to emergency healthcare. There can be an absence of shelters or other services. There are occasionally cases that you see where somebody goes to apply for a protection order, it's served on her partner that she has to go home because there's no other alternative for her to go, and there have been cases where women have died the same night. So it can be the lack of access to services, just to be able to leave, to get to courts, to go and seek counselling. I think for boys who might be in situations where they're watching their mothers being abused on a regular basis and are themselves being abused, the fact that there are no access to services often no access to services to children, can mean that they grow up perpetuating cycles of violence. People can be socially isolated. They can be experiencing violence but have no friends, have no one to turn to, and so violence continues. I spoke about the gendered social norms that encourage violence or look the other way within violence within intimate relationships, or that encourage violence or see it as being acceptable in men but not in women, and all kinds of inequalities. So I think if some of the areas I was highlighting, we were recently having a discussion with community workers in Delft and Diepsloot, and they were talking about how part of the problem, certainly in Diepsloot, with the fact that there is, in some parts of the area, roads are impassable. There are almost no roads. Lighting doesn't work. And yet there are other parts of Diepsloot which are in a somewhat better position. So those inequalities seem to be able to contribute, because there are inequalities in terms of access to services, very, very high levels of unemployment, leaving people with very little to do, and perhaps trying to cope by taking drugs or drinking, all of which contribute and aggravate problems of violence. And then histories of all kinds, personal histories of violence and individual histories and experiences of violence, communities where there might be high levels of violence, and a country where there have been high levels of violence. So these can all, so what I'm trying to highlight here is that violence is not reducible to one thing. There are many things that is a problem of, and so if you want to try to address it, we have to think about it in these complex ways, as having many different aspects to it that will all need to, in some ways, be addressed if we want to see a genuine reduction. And I want to just emphasize this point in my last slide, just in looking at some of the behavior change programs for men. So I think there has been a great deal of emphasis, which is necessary, on how do we shift these ideas that if you don't do as I ask you to do, I'm entitled to smack you because you're my wife. Or if you deny me sex, I'm allowed to take it from you by force, because that's the way things are in society, and men have these overwhelming sexual needs, and if women don't provide for them, well, that's their fault and they shouldn't be going out wearing short skirts anyway. We clearly need to be changing those kinds of gendered social norms. They make it hard to report. They increase the likelihood of victims and survivors blaming themselves and being unable to get on with their lives. And they perpetuate the idea that this behavior is not wrong, and so it's perfectly fine to continue behaving in this way. But it's clearly not enough. And here, this is just reflecting on some of the behavior change programs looking at gender norms in South Africa that have been attempted. Most of them focus on intimate partner violence. Nobody seems to have yet come up with a way of how you reduce rape that occurs outside of relationships. So there's not a lot we know about how to effectively alter that kind of behavior. And then I think then there's a very interesting program that was run in Diepsloot, and you may remember I highlighted the figures earlier, run by an organization with a lot of experience in this field. It would have been a thoughtful program. It was run in Bushbuck Ridge in Mpumalanga, showed some promise, and was then run in change of behavior, was then run in Diepsloot, showed that less violent men may have reduced their violence. But the program overall didn't have much effect, and it may even have made the most violent men more violent. So this is a very important study because it tells us we can't be glib and just rely on slogans that say enough is enough or men must change. Clearly, it's much more complicated than that. And the researchers made some suggestions as to why they thought their program wasn't as effective. And they commented on the fact that the most violent men were also men who reported some of the highest levels of depression, highest levels of childhood abuse, were also the group likely to report going hungry most often. So that is telling us that social deprivation needs to be understood in a range of different ways. That's while we have gendered norms that may encourage men to think that they are superior to women, that men live in different ways that do not give them wonderful power in all aspects of their lives, that there are in many other ways in which they struggle. And one way in which they may struggle is to be, or try to address the difficulties they have, is through the use of violence. So quite clearly, a gendered norm isn't independent of the social conditions in which it's shaped, and we need to look at those social conditions. And I'm just going to give you an example from a different perspective. This came from doing some work in Sandton with a woman commenting that it had taken many years for her to realize that she was experiencing abuse in her relationship, because in her head, women who were abused were, to use her expression, poor, toothless women on the Cape Flats. She was not a poor and toothless woman on the Cape Flats, so therefore what was happening to her was not abuse. And so it took a while for her to realize that abuse is not just something that poor men do to poor women. It is something that middle class and better off men also do to poor women, do to middle class educated women. But because we associate violence with a particular set of social conditions, and she wasn't living in those social conditions, she wasn't able to recognize what was happening to her as violence and abuse. So if we want to look at gendered norms, we also have to look at people's social conditions, and not just the social conditions of poverty and deprivation, but also those social conditions in more affluent households, which encourage people to think that what's happening to them is not violence, or that they don't want to go and report because to report experiencing violence diminishes your status, that people will look down on you if they know that you are experiencing violence. So I think just in conclude, how do we change things? We will have to do much, much more than just sign petitions, tweet, or call behavior out. We have to do things that are very much more complicated and that they are sustained and are long-term. And I think we also have to think beyond protectionism. So to go back to the point I was making about a little bit earlier, about who we think is vulnerable and who we think needs to be protected from violence, that is very gendered. It means that, in a way, we are upholding quite conservative social norms when we I think we try to say to men, protect women, don't hit women. That's a very old idea. It's not in any way one which challenges, I think, gendered norms or challenges it suggests that violence is only a problem when men hit women. It doesn't problematize men's violence towards each other. So what it does is it continues to leave normal the idea that the relationship between masculinity and violence. So I think if you want to change gendered forms of violence, it's not just problematizing men's violence towards women, it's also about problematizing men's violence towards each other and breaking that relationship between masculinity and violence. I think another place we could look at is workplace policies and practices. Workplaces can often make things quite difficult for women in that it doesn't allow them to give them time off to go and get protection orders, for example. It penalizes them. There are workplaces which dismiss women or don't take into account the fact that they haven't come to work because they've been assaulted and they don't look so good. Or, you can obviously see the black eye, so they stay home. Workplaces don't always are not always the most supportive and understanding. There's also, I think, under recognition of the way in which sometimes men show up at work and sabotage women's work and sometimes threaten other co-workers, especially if they're incredibly jealous and possessive. So I think workplaces are an important place to look and think about how do we intervene and what do we do to address violence and how do we create policies that enable action to be taken against violence, both if it occurs within the workplace and if there are employees who are experiencing violence or perhaps even perpetrating it. I think it's also really important to support services and to value social care work. For instance, the lockdown has made it extremely hard for a lot of services addressing rape and domestic violence to function in the way they should. Previously, they were getting donations from companies or from their communities, or being in a position to hold golf days or other little fundraising events. The lockdown made that very difficult. So they are struggling. One example, shelters, for instance, some shelters run sewing projects which have been very important in helping women to find an alternative source of income, to learn skills, to be able to support themselves and not be economically dependent on an abusive partner or to have to go back to him. They've had to stop those projects because the companies who are providing them with fabric or offcuts are no longer able to do so. So those sewing schemes have fallen apart, which means that a lot of women don't get out of the position of being economically dependent on their partners. So that kind of practical help for services can be incredibly important. Also, I think we underestimate, in talking about violence, we really underestimate the importance of friendship. So many women need their friends and are isolated from their friends by their abusive partners. And that merely increases the likelihood of them staying longer in a relationship because they are literally feel like they don't have anywhere to turn to any longer. So being a friend, being there to listen, to talk, to refer, to encourage, and to support is really important. And it also works on the flip side with men. Be a friend and challenge your friend if he is not behaving appropriately. And the other thing I think that is really important to bear in mind with men who use violence is quite often many of their friends or those in their circle condone violence, don't think it's much of a problem. And so it is very hard for those men to change and to behave differently when everyone around them thinks violence is okay. So if you're not supporting violence, be a friend to somebody who is trying to stop resorting to violence, to be there to encourage and to support them to behave differently. Because if you've spent a lifetime using violence as a way of getting respect and dealing with your sense of inadequacy or your sense of not being in control of the world, a little slogan like enough is enough, don't hit women, is not going to teach you how to behave differently. It's not going to tell you what to do when you get frustrated or you feel powerless or you don't or are angry. So it is important, I think, to be able to support someone to behave, to learn how to behave differently when they are struggling and not resort to violence, and to continue to encourage them to continue trying to learn those new behaviors all the time. And I think then in an individual level it is important for each and every one of us to think about, how do we think about gender? How do we think about violence? Do we think women in short skirts are asking for it? Or that you shouldn't push your partner and you should shut up when you can see he's in a bad mood? That you shouldn't really, that, you know, you might just have yourself to blame and you should really go and think about your own behavior. So, I mean, think about how you think about violence and its relationship to gender, and ask yourself some hard questions as to whether or not you might not perhaps be unintentionally overlooking a little bit of violence, and thinking about how can you change the way you think about that in order to, I think, make it easier for someone to seek help and to be able to change behavior. And then I think, you know, some of the examples I was giving you earlier suggest that in places that are deprived in South Africa, it is so much harder to be able to do something about violence. I was doing some research, I've been doing some research in the previous weeks on the West Rand, on some of those small towns which are dying because mining is coming to an end. Those jobs go, money goes, very few options are left, people lose hope. Those are the kinds of conditions that start to encourage violence. And how do we do some thinking about changing that? You know, so talking to some of the shelter staff, and they were saying things like that, you know, in an area where nobody has worked in 3 generations, where you see violence all the time and you never see people leaving and you never see people getting out and having a different life, coming along and telling them you can have a different life is hollow. You actually need to look at and find people within those particular communities that have been hard hit by very profound socioeconomic restructuring in South Africa, actual examples of men and women in those communities who have been able to lead different lives, and so give hope to others that things can be different. I don't have any solutions for that. They are the hard challenges, but I hope that we can think about them and remember that they're also part of South Africa, and we need to ensure they are not left behind and left to lives of violence and few resources. So I will end there.